not guilty. That's the plea from former Free State Premier Ace Magashule in the trial of the corrupt 2014 asbestos removal tender unfolding now in the Free State High Court in Bloemfontein. The former ANC Secretary-General and 17 others, including businessman Edwin Sodi, insist on their innocence in connection with the dodgy 255 million rand scheme to audit and remove asbestos from Free State homes. Yet state prosecutors believe that, quote, this was a thieves' picnic.
And in the end of the day, the poorest of the Free State's poor who were living with these poisonous roofs didn't have those substances removed. And instead, politicians and business people, according to the state, got very, very rich.
We cross to our specialist legal journalist Karyn Maughan at court. Later in the show, flu season's arrived early this year. And finally, a local nurse hits the jackpot.
To stay tuned to The Lead for every edition, hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels.
My name's Graham Robenheimer. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. Former Free State Premier Ace Magashule says he's always been ready to answer to the fraud, corruption and money laundering charges the states brought against him. He pleaded not guilty in the dock a little earlier following years of attempts, prosecutors allege, to delay these court proceedings. Now, Magashule's plea is now in the public legal record as we cross live to Bloemfontein with our specialist legal journalist Karyn Maughan. Thanks for chatting with us, Karyn. Welcome to The Lead. How did Mr. Magashule present himself in court a little earlier? I understand he had plenty to tell the gallery.
Yes, I think he almost relished the opportunity to take the chance to tell South Africa, to tell the court that he was pleading not guilty to all the charges against him. At one point actually saying, asking whether the state was confident of the charges that it had preferred against him in this long-awaited so-called asbestos scam case, which of course relates to the 255 million rand asbestos audit tender that was given to those two companies of Edwin Sodi's Blackhead Consulting and Igor Pambeni's Diamond Hill. And the state says was basically a mechanism for rent seeking and corruption.
Let's remind our listeners a little bit more about this case, Karyn. Essentially, as I understand it, it's a 2014 contract that the Free State Human Settlements Department then puts out. It awards it to the Blackhead Consulting venture to audit and then remove asbestos from a collection of Free State homes. But it's understood that that company only got a small fraction of the total 255 million rand contract. It only came down to, as I understand it, 21 million rand of the pie because it essentially subcontracted extensively here, and the rest of the 230 million rand, as I understand it, flew elsewhere with bribes happening allegedly. And then at the end of it all, Free State homes still sit with asbestos to this very day.
Yes, and interestingly enough, Graham, some of the charges that the accused are facing in this case relate to violations of asbestos legislation, because they say the way in which this thing was conducted actually violated the internal mechanisms by which this highly toxic substance is meant to be dealt with. And of course, that's what's so fascinating is that, we have, of course, Igor Pambeni gunned down in Sandton 2017, not in the dock today, but his wife and his brother amongst the, representing the companies that accused in this scam. And then, of course, that, trickling down of subcontracting 45 million to one company who then subcontracts another one to essentially do this audit for 21 million rand. And the state says that ultimately the final report in relation to the so-called asbestos audit was essentially based on fraud, and that it was impossible to do a proper and thorough audit of this magnitude within the 2 months that the final company finally did it. And it is, according to the state on investigation, it is evident that the audit was an elaborate fraudulent scheme, as it was inter alia clear that a large number of GPS coordinates for houses were duplicated, and coordinates for so-called asbestos houses were supplied where no houses actually existed. And in the end of the day, as you rightly point out, the poorest of the Free State's poor who were living with these poisonous roofs didn't have those substances removed, and instead politicians and business people, according to the state, got very, very rich.
Now, some of the co-accused, as I understand it, have been following your reporting from this trial via the News 24 live blog of proceedings. And it seems that some of the accused have either been ill, can't appear in court because they have health problems. Who are these co-accused, Karyn?
Well, it's Michelle Mpambeni, and she is representing one of the companies that are allegedly involving in the so-called rent-seeking scheme that the state is alleging sort of formed the basis of this so-called asbestos scam. She is the wife of the late murdered businessman Igor Mpambeni, and there was a great deal of consternation in court because she was absent from court on the day that the trial started. That was subsequently discovered by Judge Philip Loebscher, who then issued a suspended warrant of arrest for her. Her lawyer today saying that she was in hospital, unable to disclose the exact condition which she has, but the state making it very clear that it was unsatisfied with this explanation and wanted details of the hospital where she is being hospitalized so that it could do an investigation about what exactly is wrong with her and why she was not in court today.
Magashule, he's been trying to stall a lot of the proceedings for quite some time now, in fact, years. I think one of the main sort of points that he tried to get across to the court was that he wasn't necessarily the main executive member in charge of the Free State Human Settlements Department, so thus the responsibility of whatever happened with that contract would not have fallen on him squarely as a member of the Executive Council or a la MEC. Is that right?
Yes, that's one aspect of the case that he's been bringing. His lawyer, Advocate Lawrence Hodis, provided a plea explanation to the court today. He is also very aggrieved about the state's alleged mistreatment of his PA, Moradi Charlotta, who he says was implicated and persecuted, prosecution, etc., because she refused to falsely implicate him and wouldn't sign up, to become a witness against him. He's raised issues around PRECA, which is, of course, the corruption legislation that the state utilizes to pursue corruption cases. And he says under that legislation, it was obliged to engage with him before it preferred those charges against him. That allegation is being pursued by a number of the accused in this case. And of course, he will say that he raised those things not because, very a la Jacob Zuma, not because he was attempting to stall this case from getting underway. He told us yesterday that he was incredibly happy that he was finally facing this trial, facing this prosecution, that he in fact wanted it to be broadcast in its entirety so that South Africa would know what he was accused of. But he says, as Jacob Zuma does, that this is simply his vindication of his constitutional rights, and that he is trying to essentially challenge this case before it proceeded. Ultimately, though, the state, in that litigation, the courts found both in relation to him and Edwin Sodi, of course, that tenderpreneur businessman who is at the center of this case, who is challenging the so-called, what he alleges is the inappropriate and unlawful use of state capture testimony that he gave against him. The state, of course, denies that. That those cases needed to be brought within the context of the trial. And Graham, that is what is happening, in the pleas that are being lodged by all of the accused. They may laying the groundwork for what the state may allege is ultimately a Stalingrad attempt to slow down the prosecution, but which they argue is very much the defense of their constitutional rights to a fair trial.
Very quickly honing in on the PA, Moradi Charlotta. She had to be extradited from the United States by the authorities back home last year, so she came back. But she's also, as I understand it, pleaded not guilty as per your reporting. But there was one consternation about one of the particular charges that she's facing. What is that charge?
Well, essentially, he was initially accused of money laundering. And of course, in an extradition proceedings, you need to satisfy the authority that is granting the extradition that there is an equivalent charge in their legislation, and that the requirements for that charge are met in order for them to grant the extradition. And that was on the money laundering. They didn't feel that there was an equivalent within their system on the facts alleged by the state in that particular matter. And so the state has been forced to withdraw the money laundering charges against her. She is still facing corruption and fraud charges. She has pleaded not guilty, but with the proviso that she does not believe that this High Court has the jurisdiction to try her, because she, of course, has mounted an attempt to the legality, or to undermine the legality of extradition by the state. Her lawyer in court saying that she very much believes that the state lied in certain material respects to the US authorities in order to justify her extradition, and that it should ultimately be invalidated. And she, of course, Graham says she will pursue an appeal to that effect to the Supreme Court of Appeal. The state says that she is out of time to do so, and it nonetheless, has remained adamant in papers filed at the Constitutional Court that she herself has been incredibly dishonest, specifically in relation to her allegations that she was subjected to quote unquote apartheid-style tactics in order to turn on Magashule. They say they did regard her as a potential state witness against Magashule after she promised to give honest evidence, but when it became clear that she was not prepared to do so, it then charged her, and it now argues, and successfully argued to the American authorities, that it has substantive evidence to show that she was indeed part of this corrupt scheme, and that she in fact had a quote unquote secret bank account that it has included in a forensic audit that it intends to present as evidence when this trial runs.
We've seen the images of the former ANC Secretary-General coming to and from court for the longest time now. But the fact that they have now pleaded is a big deal. It's the start of finally a trial that can actually get underway, barring, of course, any possible trials within a trial, which is not out of the question. That possibly could happen and could mean that this trial will go on for a longer time still. How confident are prosecutors here? How long is this trial set down for? There's a lot of public holidays coming up. And what's the worst possible outcome for Ace? Those three questions put to you, Karyn.
I think the state is very confident. It has made that confidence very clear in relation to the extradition request that it made for Charlotta. Of course, in contrast to the failed efforts by the state to extradite the Guptas, it was overwhelmingly successful in the US, and the US authorities in their support, the US attorney in support of that extradition, made it very clear that it did believe that the state had a strong case against Charlotta, and obviously as a consequence of that, in some link way to Magashule. The trial, the Judge Loubser has made it very clear that he is going to run this thing on time. He has been meticulously punctual. Court gets underway straight away. But he suggested this could take years. And given the magnitude, the fact that we have, sort of 17 accused, multiple companies, each of them pursuing different angles, there is going to be a plethora of various applications throughout this case. And the worst possible outcome for Magashule, the minimum sentence legislation says that, corruption has a 15-year sentence. But, when in combination with the organized criminal dimension of this case, if he is convicted of these charges, he may face a far more serious sentence. Of course, he is adamant that the evidence will prove that he is completely innocent. But, we have to see, given the detailed forensic investigation that has been done, whether that particular perspective will be vindicated by the testimony, the evidence, and ultimately the finding that Judge Loubser makes in this case.
Sorry, and just to end, Judge Loubser is so punctual, in fact, that one of the co-accused was actually a bit late to proceedings this morning. Is that right?
Yes, there have been a few. It was Charlotta arrived late. She sort of brushed past me, looked slightly panic-stricken. But, some of the advocates in this case have also been late. So, when he says we're starting at 9:30, 1 minute to 9:30, you better be sitting, waiting for him, to stand up as he enters the court, because he will start at 9:30.
Sure. I wonder how bad traffic's in Bloemfontein. Karyn Maughan, our specialist legal journalist with News 24, thank you so much for keeping us up to date with that trial currently happening at the Free State High Court in Bloemfontein. I'm sure we'll chat again soon.
Thanks, Graham.
To our trending topic now, and for the first time in 15 years, South Africa's flu season has started earlier than expected. Although, according to the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, that doesn't necessarily mean the season will be more severe. Still, the NICD is calling on all of us to get the flu vaccine as soon as possible. Protection starts about 2 weeks after immunization, and it's necessary, the NICD says, to get the jab every year for efficacy. Experts at the Center for Infectious Diseases at Stellenbosch University add that even though the flu season started earlier, it doesn't mean it'll end early either. And that the recent surge may have been caused by, among other factors, an increase in travel between the northern and southern hemispheres. That story thanks to journalist Nicole McCain. And finally, what would you do with 110 million smackaroos? Well, for one anonymous South African nurse who's taking home the recent Lotto PowerBall jackpot, she plans on staying on as a healthcare provider. But not before taking her children on a beach holiday to Durban. The lucky woman says she spent 30 Rand on Quick Pick through her banking app, and at first she ignored the myriad of constant calls from her bank, only to eventually pick up and learn the life-changing news. The nurse says she was nervous at first, but while it all sinks in, she says nursing remains a true calling. And now that she's sorted financially, she'll stay on in healthcare simply for the love of it. That story thanks to Noxolo Sabia.
Looking to get lost in a new book? Well, this month's free audiobook for News 24 subscribers is How Did We Get Here? A Girl's Guide to Finding Herself by fellow health and wellness podcaster and author Mpumi Ledwaba, narrating her coming-of-age story from her upbringing to her relationships. Here's a snippet from her book.
Birds of a feather flock together, but some may have to change their feathers. And that's the story of my life. Changing my feathers to enter rooms I have no business being in, but that will lead to where I need to be. It's not a bad thing, it's the nature of life. Think about the concept of your 10,000 hours. You need to be in the right place by the time you clock those hours, or good luck putting in more time with nothing to show for it.
Well, from Ace's case to Lotto fairy tales, that's been the latest edition of The Lead. We'd love to hear from you. Mail us, give us your comments, send us voice notes at thelead@24.com. That's to be heard in our next edition. To stay tuned to every edition, hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels. Daily episodes are dropping Monday to Thursday at 7 p.m. Of course, with various public holidays coming up over the course of the next few weeks, expect updates on which days The Lead will not be broadcasting, but we'll let you know closer to the time there. My name's Graham Robenheimer, and so long as there's news, we'll have The Lead.